Okay, boom, we're live, I think. As this is my first live stream, my first YouTube live stream. Hello everyone, and maybe you can just give me a quick heads up in the chat if you're receiving this okay, and then we're gonna continue. All right, so welcome again, and today it's all about Spring Boot behind the curtains. And I've been giving the same talk at a couple of different user groups, local user groups, because I think it's a very important topic, because a lot of people actually know how to create a Spring Boot project, start it up, slap a couple of annotations on a couple of classes, and then you have a Tomcat booting up, you have Hibernate pre-configured, and your REST controller working, but the question is, how is that matching actually working internally? How does Spring Boot do it? And that's what we're hopefully going to find out. And this talk is a bit shorter, a bit denser, a bit quicker than what I usually give, because we have to fit it into 1 hour exactly. But you'll find some resources at the end of the talk, links, the source code, videos on my homepage, which cover the same topics, basically a bit more in detail. So I say, let's give it a go. And for that, let me just switch to my IDE. That is actually the only slide you're going to see, because it shows you what we're going to do is the talk or the live stream event is basically in 3 parts. The first part is we're going to have a look at the Spring Boot's embedded web server, how it works. And you can always ask questions during the live stream. I'll try to have 3 quick breaks where I'm going to give answers to those questions. Then the second part is how do the properties files work? And we're going to create that property magic ourselves. And then we're going to look at some real Spring Boot source code and see if what we did matches with whatever these guys, the Spring Boot maintainers, did. All right, so to get started quickly, it's a very simple project I have here. It's an empty Maven project with just the main class, hello YouTube. I'll just run that to see if everything is still working. And also the POM.xml file is, yes, and that works. The POM.xml file is rather simple, no dependencies, Maven 1.8. The Java version doesn't actually really matter. The principle is the same for every Java version. And we're going to start with the Tomcat embedded web server support. And for that, I know that I need a library. So I can go to a page like mavenrepo.com, look for something called Tomcat embed. And there's a ton of versions here on the page. Doesn't really matter which one you use. I'll just use the 8.537. Copy that to your project, paste it in, and compared to Tomcats in the past where you had to install and maintain a Tomcat, this dependency is everything you need to get a Tomcat up and running. So nothing else, no ops guys maintaining your Tomcat anymore. And when you go to the main class, let's write some code. Let's try to instantiate a Tomcat, which is rather simple because you can just write tomcat equals new Tomcat. And that's pretty much that. You can set a port, which is by default 8080. And Spring Boot later on will obviously make that port configurable. So you can put in any port here, but that doesn't matter. And then you can call Tomcat start. And that's everything that you need to have a fully working Tomcat up and running. And when you think about the URL you want to call later on in your browser, you're going to have something like localhost 8080, then a context, and then your URL like login or register or something like that. And with Tomcat, what you can do is you can add a context, and if you want that empty here, you just add something which I call a null context, like so. So you have your context. And to get that login part up and running, you need a servlet. And that servlet, a plain old HTTP servlet, you can add to the context. You give it a name, so like hello servlet, something like that. And then you need to put in the servlet in here. And obviously Spring Boot later on doesn't put a hello servlet in here. It has a dispatcher servlet, and that's the servlet which takes all the requests of your application and directs them to the appropriate REST controller or controller. But again, the principle is still the same. You need an entry point to your application. And then you can add a mapping because you want it to map to /. Actually make sure that the name matches, right? So not to /login, but just to /. And that should pretty much be it. Now let's write that servlet. You create that class, and it extends from HTTP servlet, not request, just a servlet. And you might want to override a method, the doGet method, because we just respond to GET calls. And in here, you just, we're going to make the JavaScript crowd envious of how we write HTML, because we're just going to write a plain string like that. Not even proper HTML, but it will do for us. So in here you can maybe print out the current timestamp, something like that. That's the servlet, and that's everything we hopefully need. Actually, I'll take one thing away, and I'm talking about this in my videos in more detail. But the problem is Tomcat, when it starts up, we can actually try that here. Let's see what happens. When Tomcat starts up, you can see in the console that it boots up on port 8080. You see some log messages regarding Tomcat, but it finishes again in a second. So it shuts itself down. And that's because you have to have a separate thread actually that blocks Tomcat from shutting down. And it looks something like this. And again, I'm gonna cut it short. It's just a thread you need. And you might be thinking, why am I talking so much about Tomcat? It's because that code you're writing here, you'll see it later on one-to-one, apart from the hello servlet in Spring Boot source code, because all that plumbing code is a huge part of what Spring Boot is. All right, so we restart the application. Now it doesn't shut down again. And when I go to localhost 8080, I can see the current timestamp, which is a great homepage, I suppose. A really good homepage. Now we have the bit where we boot up Tomcat, just the see the current timestamp. And now we want to get onto Spring Boot or whatever Spring Boot does. And the intermediary step is springifying the project. So just plain Spring, no Spring Boot, but springifying the project. And for that, I need one more library. Let me just open up Maven repo again. I will go to something like Spring Context. That's the only library, again, you'll need, which is quite nice because in legacy projects, you'll have tons of Spring libraries. And it's good to know that you, in fact, only need one library which pulls in a couple of other transitive dependencies as well. But that's all you need to get started with the Spring project. And in here, you probably want to have something like a class Tomcat launcher with a method called launch. And you'll just move all the code inside here, just like that. Clean it up a tiny bit and move the class outside, like so. And then back in your main class, obviously there's several ways of doing the Spring instantiation. And just a quick, because I saw Jörg's question, do you start Tomcat now twice? No, I'm only starting it once, but again, I'll try to cover all the questions in a couple of minutes when we're through with the section. All right, so what we need is a Spring context, and you know that you can configure a Spring context with XML, with Java config, Again, that doesn't really matter. We're just going to create a plain Java config. And you can do it by doing something like configuration, and then you have your my app config, something like that. And again, if you want to have Spring Beans, there's multiple ways of doing that. I'm just choosing one here, and that is by having a Tomcat launcher here, and just returning a new Tomcat launcher. That's it. The main class has one of my favorite the main method now instantiates one of my favorite classes. It's the annotation config application context. And in here, you want to put the myAppConfig class. So just to recap what's happening here, we create a new annotation context by reading in the myAppConfig class. The myAppConfig class has a Tomcat launcher, and then the Tomcat launcher should actually launch a Tomcat automatically. And you can do that by just annotating the launch method with add_post_construct. So that should actually pretty much have the same effect, i.e. booting up Tomcat. And we can try it again and see what happens when we start the application. If I did something wrong, it doesn't look like it. I can still see Tomcat port 8080. And let's open up the world's best website again. And you can see you still get the timestamp. Now, that is probably not as exciting because you might think, why did we just do that? Why did we just create that Spring context? And what's going on here? Because that's a very important intermediary step between Spring Boot and just instantiating plain Tomcats. And we'll have a look at what Spring Boot actually does, or what Spring Boot is, in the next part, where we'll modify the app config in such a way that it's pretty much similar to what Spring Boot does. All right. Now, in school, they call it kind of transfer work. You have to trust me a bit on this for a second. Imagine that the myAppConfig is not called myAppConfig, but it's rather called something like default config. And also imagine that the default config doesn't live inside our project, the Jug project here, but it actually lives somewhere else in a library, in a third-party library, which is called Spring Boot, for example. And obviously, I cannot show that here because the class is inside my project, but just imagine that class, the default config class, is somewhere else. And in your own application, you'd have your own app config again, myAppConfig, something like that. And as you also know, when you run a Spring Boot application, you annotate it with an annotation called add Spring Boot application. And just for a second, imagine that this annotation is similar to importing that default config, not the default resource loader, but the default config. Excuse me. Like so. And it's not entirely true. So these two equal signs here are basically a JavaScript equals. It's not really the same thing, but with a bit of type conversion, it's the same thing. So just imagine you're importing a default config here. So in your myApp, you have a library, and you say, give me the default config. Now, the problem is the default config always gives you a Tomcat, and it always boots up a Tomcat on port 8080. Maybe you don't want a Tomcat. Maybe you want a Jetty. Maybe you don't want any Tomcat at all. Maybe you want an Undertow web server. And the question is, how can you decide what the default config boots up? And that's one of the main concepts of Spring Boot. It's the concept of conditionals. And you can have a condition, there's actually a Spring annotation for it, add conditional, which says only boot up the Tomcat launcher if a specific condition is true. And one of these conditions could be that Tomcat is on class path as a library. So you can find it here in your project. And that means you're going to have something like Tomcat on class path condition, something like that. Let's create it. It has just one matches method where you have to say, is it true or is it not true? And a quick and easy way to check if a library is on the class path is actually trying to get a class reference. And when you look at the Tomcat launcher, you can see it tries to instantiate a new Tomcat. And what you can do is, quick and dirty, copy that Tomcat here, the fully qualified class reference, go to your condition, and then try to get the class for that string, just like that. And if you cannot get the class reference, you'll get a class not found exception. You just return false, and you can ignore the exception. And otherwise, it's true, Tomcat is on class path. So that's pretty much anything you need. You need a condition which checks is the class here, and if it's here, you just assume the whole library is on the class path. All right, let's try that out again. I will spare you the website for a second. And you'll see that Tomcat still boots up. I will spare you the homepage. And now the test, the negative test, is actually going to pom.xml and taking the Tomcat away from the class path. And you can do that by going scope equals provided in Maven. It's a bit different in Gradle, but that scope basically means that during compile time, you'll have the library on the class path. During runtime, you don't have the library on the class path. And if everything's working, our Tomcat on class path condition should actually fail, which should mean no Tomcat is booting up, which means everything that we pretty much wanted. Let's try it out. Even though it's not as cool to see in the console, but as you can see, I just ran the program and you saw no Tomcat and the process finished. And that's great. There was no error message, no stack trace. The condition actually worked. So what I want you to keep in mind is, for a second, you have some sort of a default config. That Spring Boot is nothing but a default config. And if you have a Tomcat on the class path, Spring Boot will certainly just boot up the Tomcat. And we can actually have a look at some Spring Boot source code right now to see if that's true. And I have the whole Spring Boot project checked out on my PC. And there's a couple of modules in here. And the modules that most people know are the starter modules. These are what pull in the dependencies in your projects. And usually for a web application, you start with Spring Boot Starter Web, something like that. And when I started doing the talk, I thought, well, inside these starter projects, everything happens. But when you open them up, quads, for example, security, for example, tests, for example, Thymeleaf, you see you only have pom.xml files in here. There's no code, there's nothing else inside. And the web pom.xml references by default the Spring Boot Starter Tomcat. And when you look at Spring Boot Starter Tomcat and open up the pom.xml file, you'll see it just has a few dependencies. And the most important one is the Tomcat embed core dependency, the same dependency we put into our project. And then the JavaX annotation API and WebSocket support you can ignore. But the whole starter project is just one dependency, which basically makes Spring Boot decide, please boot up a Tomcat. And I'll show you the code later on with the conditional in part 3 of the talk. But for now, it's good enough for the first part to see these starter dependencies, and that it's basically just class path matching, where you have to trust me on this. All right, quick look at the chat and seeing if everything is okay, and answering some questions. I can see, I'll start from behind. Trollmaster, man, why do people like this resource hogging IDE? It's a very good question. You basically make your name, how should I say? You're really trolling. It's a really good IDE. It has a ton of features, and it works just quite well for whatever I do. And I think IDEA or IntelliJ is a great IDE which makes things more productive. And as for Jörg, with the Tomcat starting twice, I wasn't quite sure why you'd think that Tomcat starts twice, but maybe you can write that into the chat again as well, and we'll figure it out later on. And obviously, if anyone else has any other questions, please hit me with them, and then I'll try to give you an answer on these questions. All right, then I'd say we continue with part 2 of the project actually. And part 2 of the project, part 1, is having a quick look at, or was having a look at the dependency management. Part 2, it has to do with the property files. And for that, let's go back to Java User Group project. And as you might know, or when you've done some Spring Boot projects before, you know you can just create a file called application properties, put it inside your jar file or inside your source main resources folder, and then you can just start writing here your properties, whatever. And then there's more files which you can create, like application. For example, when you boot up the application with a profile, it could be application-production.properties, something like that. So there's a multitude of files. And if you're actually unsure where Spring Boot tries to pull all these files from, you can search for Spring Boot externalize config. You'll find a homepage, a documentation page, and I hope you can read that right, but basically what you have is 17 different locations where Spring Boot tries to pull properties files from, and they all have a different order. So basically they override each other. If you give a command line argument, level number 4, for example, it will override Java system properties or environment variables. But Spring Boot will try to look at all these different places, like as I just mentioned, application-profile properties, inside and outside your jar file, application properties inside and outside your jar file. So there's a whole lot of places where Spring Boot tries to look for properties. And it's actually a good idea to have a look at that page and find out where Spring Boot tries to pull in properties from. And we're not going to build the whole thing. We're just going to build 1 or 2 of these locations just to see how that works. And that means going back again to the default config. And in here, you can simply say, there's a couple of ways of doing this, but you can say, let's have a property source. And that property source will be something like class path, look for application properties. Now, if that file doesn't exist, and that's a second feature of Spring Boot, let's say, you will, when you run the program, get an error, a mistake. And that's because it's fail fast. But Spring Boot is actually a lazy fail, so we'll just ignore the error. And you can do that by saying with a flag, ignore resource not found true. Yes, so just ignore it if the file is missing. And if you want to have more property sources, what you can do is you can just specify them like so. And you can say, well, I have 1, I want to have 2 here. And you can even put placeholders in here if you want to get the active profile. You can do it with something like on the class path, check for file application dash whatever name the active profile has, and ignore it if the resource is not found. Right, so let's start the application. Let's see if I did something wrong. It should just boot up Tomcat, and you get 2 information log messages saying that I could not find the properties file. But apart from that, there's no stack trace, no exception, no nothing. That's good. All right. Now what we're going to do is we're going to implement the data source support, so database access in Spring Boot. Because in Spring Boot, when you go to a properties file, you can write something like Spring data source URL equals, and then Spring data source driver class name equals. These are the 2 variables you need, and to get a database connection up and running. And I know that I don't want to connect to a MySQL database, to a Postgres database, Oracle. I'll just connect to make things really simple to an in-memory Java database. And that database is called H2, so I'll just get the dependency like so. just the latest one, doesn't really matter. I'll just paste it in here. Right. And I also know later on in a second I'll need another Spring library, the Spring JDBC library, so that's all the libraries I need. The database comes with that dependency though. And back in the properties file, hopefully I get that right. The connection string is, I think, JDBC h2 mem to connect to an in-memory database. And the driver I can autocomplete, it's org h2 driver, so that should pretty much work. And again, we're going back to our default config. So not our app config, but our default config. And here, what you want to do is say you want to have a new bean. It's going to be a data source. And that's what I just needed Spring for. Excuse me. Right, so we have a simple driver data source. It needs a driver and it needs a URL. Not easy to talk today. Right, the driver is a local variable, the URL is a local variable, and you need to construct the driver and the URL from the properties file. And again, there's a couple of ways of getting these property values that we just put in here. And actually, let me just rename that to application properties, not the production properties, right? And one way, I'll show you why in a second, is by injecting the environment. And the environment has a method getProperty, Spring data source .ul. Gives you the URL, and that's that. Then you need to construct a driver. And for the driver, it's a bit more tricky. Actually, let me just check what the thing is called. Right, like so. Back to the default config, driver class name. And again, you don't need a string, you need a driver class or a driver object. And we'll just use some quick and dirty reflection to create that driver. Like so. So you have a couple of exceptions you need to put there. And then a cast at the end. It's a bit dirty, but that's pretty much everything you need. So you have your data source, and that's just a plain good old Spring data source. It will always be instantiated. But just as with the Tomcat, you only want to instantiate the data source if a certain condition matches. And for that, actually, let's just quickly go back to our main class because we want to see if things actually work. And what we're going to do in a second, if everything is working as expected, we're trying to get a bean, a data source bean, like so, the data source. And then later on, we do data source, give me a database connection, something like that. We can actually wrap it like so. And we can print out in the console. Maybe let's do something like print out connection is valid. We just check out if we get a valid connection in 5 seconds, which is plenty of time to get a connection from an in-memory database. And prefix it like so, so we can actually see it. And right, so that's what we have. We have, let me just try and see if that already works. Actually, it would actually work because we have our bean instantiated, but I only want it to work in a certain condition. And the condition is that I have, let's say, the data source properties set, something like that. Yeah. So when you go inside here, you create that condition. You want to say only if the user set these two properties, only if these two properties are set, then you boot up the data source. And if you don't have these properties set, then don't boot up the data source. So let's finish up our condition here. Actually, let's go back inside here. What you can do is you can copy that bit, the get property, into our database property source set condition. Let me just put a condition at the end here, right? And then you can get the current environment. like so. And you don't call get property, but you call something which is called contains property, and it just tells you, hey, is that property set? And then we want to check for the other property as well. Something like that. I'll just quickly copy and paste that so I don't make a mistake in here. Like so. And obviously now we only check that these properties are being set. We do not check for the value of these properties. You could also put a value check in here. That's what Spring Boot does later on. But in the end, it just has a look. Do you have these two properties? And if you have these two properties, try and create a data source. And if we run our program now, hopefully we see that we can get a database connection. Let's give it a try. Right, and that was pretty quick, but as you could see, is you get connection is valid, is true. We could actually get a database connection. You could now start, creating tables, selecting some queries and whatever, but the condition was true. And if we try to, we can make the negative test again. If we try to take these two properties away and run the program again, you now get an exception, and that exception is no such bean definition exception. There is no bean data source, and that is because the data source didn't get instantiated in the first place. Exactly what we wanted. I'll just put in these two lines again, and that pretty much somehow what concludes the second part of the talk. And that is, in addition to these class path conditions, you also have conditions which are pretty much based on properties that you find in property files or in these 17 other different locations. And now, before I go have a look at the questions, we're gonna see how the real Spring Boot source code does things in a second, and see if what we did with these conditions is actually what Spring Boot mainly consists of. But first, I'm going to have a quick look at the questions again. All right, Jörg said, I was not familiar with the await part. It's true, yes, I was also not familiar with the wait part. It's basically the architecture of Tomcat, because they have a separate connection pool handling the requests. And if you don't block the main thread that Tomcat starts up on, it will just say no requests, and then you're pretty much gone. So it's a tiny thing. Andre says, sorry, I'm on the train. Will the talk be recorded and uploaded? Yes, it will be recorded, and it will also be uploaded. Trollmaster, what happens when it ignores fail first? What happens is that you get, instead of a stack trace and instead of the application not booting up, so it will just fail, you get a stack trace saying application cannot boot up, you will get log messages, these warning messages you saw before, instead of completely failing. Why did you remove the scope in the dependency? Yes, as I said, all right, you mean from the H2 dependency, is because I think by default the website I copied the H2 dependency from has a test scope in here, but I don't want H2 for testing, I want H2 for production basically, so just running my program with H2, and that's why I had to delete the scope. Right. The autocomplete on non-Java files, is it the free version of JetBrains? It is not the free version of IntelliJ. It is the ultimate paid version, but even the plain free community version, if you're just using Java, just plain Java, has a couple of great autocompletes, a couple of great features that you can have a look at. And as to your other question, which version of Java am I using? It's just Java 1.8. I showed it at the very beginning. You'll see it in here, Java 1.8. And when it comes to Spring Boot, apart from some compatibility problems, it doesn't really matter which Java version you are using for that, but 1.8 is just fine. All right. One last question. You're new to Maven. When I say scope test, it means I can't use it outside the tests. Yes, exactly. When you're scoping it to tests, basically, if you have a test scope in here, you can only use it for tests that you put under the folder source test Java, for example, and you cannot use it for your main production code. And that's the problem. Can you overview me of what you're doing? I have just joined. For that, I beg you to just go back. I think you can replay the live stream. At the very beginning, you'll see a tiny quick overview of what I'm doing at the moment. And you can just catch up in a bit, really. So I don't have to go through the talk twice again. All right, that looks like these questions for part 2 are fine. And just to remember again, we had a look at class path dependency management. We had a look at the property management of Spring Boot. And now we're going to have a look at what real Spring Boot source code looks like. And for that, let's go back to the Spring Boot project again. And we had a look at the Spring Boot starters module before, and there's a couple of other modules. And I don't want to say anything bad about all the other modules, but the only really important module, everything that you think of when thinking of Spring Boot, is basically in the autoconfigure module. And when you open it up, and when you go to the pom.xml file, you'll see, and I'll just basically can endlessly scroll here, what you basically can see is that there's every single library that you have that Spring Boot supports. When I search for Hibernate, for example, you'll see that Hibernate is in here, so database library. When you search for FreeMarker templating library, it's in here, Elasticsearch, everything is in here. But again, with a scope or being set to optional, which pretty much means the same thing we did before, which means the autoconfigure module can work with these libraries, but it's also fine if you don't put these libraries in here. And when you open up the autoconfigure thingy, you'll see that there's one package, the autoconfigure package, and it has libraries or sub-packages for every library, for every dependency that Spring Boot supports. So you have AOP, you have Cassandra, Cloud, Deos, Elasticsearch, Flyway, every library you have in the pom.xml file, you'll also see in the autoconfigure package. And here's where I lied at the beginning. When you look at the Spring Boot application annotation, that's the one you need for every Spring Boot application. I said it's pretty much similar to importing like a default context. But it's not really a default context. Instead, the annotation consists of other annotations, and there's two important ones, a component scan and then an enable autoconfiguration annotation. And these two annotations mean that Spring scans all these packages for classes which are called autoconfiguration. So when you look inside AOP, for example, you have a class called AOP autoconfiguration. When you look inside Cassandra, you have a class called Cassandra autoconfiguration. When you look inside Flyway, you have a class called Flyway autoconfiguration, and obviously a couple of more configuration classes. And the same for H2, the same for Hibernate, the same for everything. And when I look at the JDBC package, for example, you'll find something which is called data source autoconfiguration. And that sounds pretty much like what we did or what we just programmed a couple of minutes ago. And when you go to that file, you'll see there's actually a ton of annotations going on here. But what I want you to focus on, for example, is this class, the pool data source configuration. So that is when you use a connection pool in the real world, like Hikari or like the Tomcat connection pool or whatever. And it's just a normal Spring configuration, so pretty similar to what we had before with our default config. And it has one conditional statement. And the conditional says, have a look at the pool data source condition. And when I go inside that class, there's again a couple of other code lines going on, but in the end, it's just another annotation saying conditional on property. That means the property spring.datasource.type must be set. And that's a quick detour because we haven't seen that annotation before. And when you go to the package, what you will see is that in addition to the usual Spring conditional annotation, Spring Boot has a couple of more annotations. And it has a conditional bean annotation, for example, which checks if the user already created a bean, and only then I will create my own bean. And there's the opposite for that, conditional on missing bean, which means only if the user has not specified such a bean, only then I create a bean. Then you have conditional on class, for example, which is what we had before, where you check is a class on the class path. And you even have conditions like conditional on Java, which is the Java version. So make one bean for Java version 1.6, one and a different bean for Java version 1.7, 1.8, stuff like that. Then you have stuff like conditional on not a web application or conditional on web application, where Spring Boot is checking, am I running in a web application or am I not running in a web application? So you have all these different conditional cases that Spring Boot basically comes with. Now, when I go back to the data source autoconfiguration, we have that here. And then the next line we see there's a condition on missing bean, which means only continue with that code if the user did not specify a data source himself, or if he specified a distributed data source himself. So only if these conditions are matching, then create a pooled data source configuration. And here it gets tricky as well, because as you can see, Spring Boot tries to import every library, every configuration class for every library it supports. So you have a configuration for Hikari, you have a configuration for Tomcat, you have a configuration for DBCP2, and so on and so forth. And when you go inside here into Hikari, for example, you'll see there's even more annotations going on. So you have a conditional on class. You check again, is a Hikari data source class on the class path? So did you add the library to the project? You have a conditional on missing bean. Only do it if the data source is missing, if there's no such bean. Only do it if there's a property called spring.datasource.type with that value. That's what I talked about before. There's also a value check in here. And only if these conditions match, then you create a data source. And the data source is just a simple, plain Spring bean, as you can see. It's just a Hikari data source. We created a simple driver data source before, but it's just normal Spring classes that get instantiated by having a couple of conditions being met. And if these conditions don't match, then you don't get a data source. But that's pretty much everything that happens in Spring Boot. So you add that library. You have the component scan and enable auto-configuration active. And then Spring Boot scans the auto-configure package in here. So it just scans through, checks every configuration, for example, for Flyway. You check all the conditions. And if the conditions are true, then you just create some Spring beans. And these Spring beans are the beans you would otherwise create yourself or have to read up the documentation, something like that. But in the end, it's just plain Spring that is being auto-configured here. Nothing too exciting. And when you look at, we had a look at the data source now. There's also obviously the web server support, the Tomcat that we started up at the very beginning. And when you look at the web package, for example, you'll find there's an embedded package inside. And that embedded package has a class called, and I like the class name, it's called Embedded Web Server Factory Customizer Autoconfiguration. And that is pretty much what boots up, the class that boots up your Tomcat. Let's have a look. When you go inside, you'll see it has, again, it's basically some sort of an architecture. They have these nested classes. What you have inside is a Tomcat web server factory customizer, which is conditional on two classes being on the class path, Tomcat class, what we did before, and upgrade protocol class. And if these two classes are there, then Tomcat is being booted up. When you scroll down, you'll see there's a Jetty web server configuration, which just checks for, is there a server class, loader class, another class which are Jetty specific classes. And if you have the Jetty specific classes on the class path, then the only thing that happens is that Jetty boots up. So it's just a simple check, is a library on the class path, and if that's the case, then Jetty boots up, otherwise Tomcat boots up, otherwise Undertow boots up. No real magic going on here. And the problem is that the web server support itself is this guy here, the factory customizer, allows you to do things like setting properties, like a different port for your Tomcat or whatever, stuff like that. But you'll find that the Spring guys wrapped the Tomcat classes we used before ourselves in another class called Tomcat Web Server. And here I'll just want to do a quick check if the code that we wrote is also inside the plain Spring Boot code. And for that, if you remember at the beginning, we had to add a context. That is basically what happens here. We had to start our Tomcat, so pretty much that's it. And before you add the context or find the context, obviously you set the port and all that kind of stuff, but in the end, context and starting Tomcat. And last but not least, you'll see you have the thread, the daemon await thread. And when you go inside here and you check out what's going on here, you'll see the only thing that happens in that thread is it calls Tomcat get server await. So it tries to pretty much block Tomcat from shutting down again. And it's exactly the same code, just a couple more lines than what we did at the very beginning. So that's everything that Spring Boot basically is trying to configure Tomcat, booting Tomcat up when it's on the class path, and all of that with plain Spring classes. All right, that again was quite quick because I'm a bit time constrained here. But again, if you have any questions, then now is the time to shoot them in the chat. We have a couple of minutes left, and then I'll see if I can get an answer. If you have any questions to Tomcat or to what you just saw, the properties or the Spring Boot source code, autoconfigure module, just let me know. Anything goes. Could also be relating to your project. I'll try to find an answer for that, and I'll just wait a second and drink a tiny bit in the meantime. All right, so it almost looks like that things are pretty much clear. Let's see. You found the right. Thank you, Andre. So Andre is just saying he found the talk useful. Thanks again. No worries. What I want you to take away is a couple of things, even though the whole thing was quite quick and quite compressed, is that there's no difference between Spring Boot and Spring, for example. Spring Boot is just taking a couple of Spring classes, then having all these auto-configuration classes, and then running through a couple of conditions, and if these conditions match, then create a Hibernate connection, a database connection, create a REST controller, all this kind of stuff. So if you run into problems or want to know what Spring Boot really does, it's a really good idea to have a look at the autoconfigure module and just have a look at what all these different small submodules do, whatever free marker, whatever gets instantiated. The entry point is always the autoconfiguration class, and you'll find here what exactly is being instantiated or is being done. So that's a good help. And apart from that, Spring Boot is pretty much only plumbing. So it's only infrastructure, setting ports here and there, making sure this is available, all that kind of stuff. So nothing too exciting, nothing too crazy. It's all plain Spring after all. And as I said, if you want to have a closer look again at a more, let's say a more detailed look, a slower look, because I was quite fast today, as always, you can go on my homepage. And here you'll find, as you probably notice, I make a lot of different courses on tons of different topics, from microservices to plain Java features, OAuth or whatever. But you'll also find, let me just search for that for a second, parts of the talk, and there's more episodes to come. You'll find them here. And you can pretty much watch these episodes as well in your own time. You'll see me at the beginning talk, just like you just saw me now, just a bit slower and a bit more detailed. And then you can just follow me in the IDE, whatever you just also saw, and have a bit more detail, including source code and whatnot, if you want to get more into detail on Spring Boot again. But I'll just have a quick look if we have new questions. And yes, there is new questions. If we have the undertow web server class in the class path, what happens? Yes, what happens is that Spring Boot is trying to instantiate the undertow web server. That's really all there is. And the problem is if you have both libraries in the class path, so Tomcat and undertow, then you'll get a conflict. And the thing is, that's why you need to exclude pretty much the Tomcat if you want to use Jetty. And by excluding, I mean, when I go back here, by excluding actually to my project, you'll need to make sure it's just pseudocode, so it doesn't make sense, but you have this exclusion block here, and you can exclude the, I think it's org Apache or whatever it is, and you have the artifact, the Tomcat, something like that, the Tomcat embed core, and obviously you don't exclude it from the H2 database dependency, you exclude it from the Spring Boot starter web dependency, but you have to make sure that the dependency is being excluded, then you include undertow, and then everything should work as expected. Right. Trollmaster says, when you show Tomcat, Jetty and the third server, no, Spring Boot doesn't try to boot them all up in the in that order. Spring Boot checks the conditions. And when you have a look at the Spring Boot project again and at the web server factory, you'll see the condition is Tomcat on the class path. Then the condition here is Jetty on the class path. Then the condition here is undertow on the class path. And if you only have Tomcat on the class path, then only this guy gets booted up. And by default, you do not have Jetty and undertow on the class path, so these two do not get instantiated. So there's nothing happening here, only if you explicitly include it, because by default, it comes with only Tomcat. Right, I can now see past the magic. Yes, that's great, thank you. Then Anthony is asking, off topic, I'd like some help. I have a REST API which depends on other external APIs, some asynchronous, some synchronous. This makes my API unstable and unpredictable. How do I reduce errors? A friend suggested queuing messaging, kind advice. Yes, it is a bit out of topic, unfortunately, for that talk. You can feel free to send me an email or to post it in the forum with a bit more detail, except these 2 lines. And I'll try to give you an answer or reply in the next couple of days. Yeah? I try to follow up on every email, really, I do. All right, so I see we are just in time. I pretty much hustled through the whole thing. The hour is pretty much over, and that was my goal. I hope you guys learned something about Spring Boot, took something away from it, so you're not too... let's say that you actually know what's going on when you run into a problem, when you have to debug something, when you have to play with auto configurations and whatnot. And that was my goal. Thank you for listening. Again, check in on my website, subscribe for the newsletter. You'll always get new and useful Java tips and tricks and whatnot, and videos, obviously. And I hope to see you next time in the next live stream, where you can also let me know any suggestions you have, any topics, anything you'd see covered. I usually do whatever the subscribers or what my viewers want to see. All right, thanks for today and have a good one.